Thank you, Carly. Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining me today. So as Carly mentioned, we're going to be discussing how to plan a successful return to work. So before we go into the actual presentation itself, I think it's important that you know a little bit about me. As Carly mentioned, my name is Mei Lin Yee. I just completed a master's degree in law. I did work as an attorney, particularly in labor law, for about 6 years, and I have a little bit more than 20 years of experience in human resources management, dealing primarily with benefits, insurance, things like that, helping people transition from, either leaving the office, going onto sick leave, or vice versa. I've also been living with stage 4 breast cancer for the past 12 years now. So I think it puts me in a unique position to be able to share with you both sides of the coin. So today we're going to look at how you should speak to your employer. We're going to look at how you do the transition from disability to full-time employment. We'll plan for your return to work, and we'll discuss a little bit about your rights and your responsibilities, as well as the rights and responsibilities of your employer. So I think probably the hardest thing that we all have to do when we are dealing with a cancer diagnosis and having to deal with our employer as well is, we're not really sure how to speak to our employer. So the first thing I tell people is really, it's always important that before you even start communicating with your employer, that you be prepared. And so by being prepared, what I mean is, number one, keep it simple. I know from experience as the person in HR, receiving phone calls from people who were going through something like this, it was always easier for me to speak to people who had everything planned out and were telling me, A, B, C, because I didn't have to ask them questions. And sometimes, as the HR person, you're feeling a little bit nervous. You're not really sure how to approach the person. So when an employee was calling me and really providing me with all of the information I needed to begin with, that made it a lot easier. Now, dealing as the patient, I also realized how important it was for me to make sure that I was fully prepared before I picked up the phone to speak to my employer. The first thing I think that you must do is, yes, keep it simple. So by keeping it simple, really what I'm saying is, this is a case in which less is more. Do not go into the details around your diagnosis above and beyond the fact that, yes, you do have a cancer diagnosis. And I think this is important simply because the cancer journey changes, and sometimes what our original diagnosis was ends up not being our final diagnosis. And so rather than going into full details, it's just easier and simpler to state the facts as we know them at the time. The other thing is, you don't want to feel bound by something that you said to your employer in the past about your health that might not be the case farther down the road. And, as I mentioned earlier, people feel uncomfortable when they're talking about cancer. So, not only are you feeling uncomfortable about it, but the person on the other end of the line is feeling uncomfortable. So yeah, just keep it simple. Then it tends to become less emotional on both sides of the phone call. And that's when it's actually an easier conversation to have. And when you're talking about your diagnosis to your employer, part of the simplicity really revolves around just sharing with your employer what it is they need to understand as it affects your work. They don't need to know how your cancer diagnosis affects anything else. They just need to know how it affects your work. It's also important when you're speaking with your employer that you share with them timelines. And that's really so that your employer has an understanding of how they need to prepare for the fact that you're going to be away from work. Usually your doctors or your nurses or your social worker are able to give you a better understanding of what your timelines look like or may look like, so that you're able to share with your employer typically how long you normally would be away from work for, and typically what a progressive return to work would look like. And here, as well as throughout the whole conversation that you have with your employer, it's always essential that you get key points in writing. So what I often recommend to people is that as they're communicating, if it's via phone or via text or via email, just make sure that your communications are clear, and that if it's a phone call, you always follow it up with something in writing that confirms what your phone call said. The other thing that I think it's important to understand is who you actually need to be sharing this information with. Different companies have different setups. If you have an HR department, I highly recommend that you be sharing all of this confidential information only with the HR department. If your company does not have an HR department, then you should be speaking with the person that you typically speak with when you're looking at being away from work. So if it's your supervisor, then you would be speaking to your supervisor at first. But then normally what would happen is when you're looking at getting all of your paperwork ready, supervisors tend to say, okay, so now you need to be dealing with the finance department because they manage that issue. And then that's when you begin transitioning your conversations over to that department. But if you have coworkers, asking for details, or other people outside of those who you typically have conversations with about being away from work, you are not obliged to share that information with them. And oftentimes I say to people, unless it's really somebody that you're turning to as a friend, I recommend that you keep the more sort of personal aspects or timeline related aspects of your return to work just between you and the person directly responsible, because those can change. So I think, if it's managed in a way that there aren't expectations throughout the company that you be showing up at a certain date, then that's probably better for everybody involved. And as I said, really all you need to be sharing with your employer is anything related specifically to how your diagnosis prevents you from returning back to the office. So you don't need to be sharing anything else. And I know a lot of times people are concerned that, maybe their company is going to call the oncologist, or their company is going to call the insurance company to find out things. And there are laws around what information your oncologist or your insurance company are allowed to share with your employer. So you don't need to worry about, anything that your oncologist has said or that your oncologist has shared with the insurance company somehow getting back to your employer. The only thing that the insurance company can share with your employer is any information, again, affecting when and how you will be returning to work. I want to talk a little bit about whether or not you should be staying at work or choose to go on sick leave. And this is because, now with all of these new innovative treatments, it's very possible that you can actually be in chemotherapy or, some sort of cancer treatment, and be able to go to work. However, I think it's important for you to understand that in most instances, this is actually something that is not forced upon you, but it's a choice that you have. So, what I recommend to people is that they really think about what scenario is best for them psychologically, physically, and financially. And it's so important that you think ahead when it comes to this issue. Um, it's important to understand that yes, you are dealing with a cancer diagnosis and it will have effects on your body. But I think many people, particularly at the beginning um, of their diagnosis, are really not wanting to have to either give up their job or give up their routine. But on the other hand, if your oncologist and if your nurses are saying to you, we recommend that you take time away from work, it's really important to listen to what they're saying, because they probably have, they've seen this before. I can tell you in my specific case, I actually thought that I was able to continue working, and I did so for a long time. I continued to go to work, and many times what ends up happening is employers actually forget that you're in cancer treatment, and they begin to expect that you deliver at the rate that you were delivering at previous to your cancer diagnosis. So I probably did myself more harm than good by continuing to work. And I probably should have listened to my oncologist and my nurses and stepped away from my job sooner. So it's really important that you take all of that into consideration when you make the decision as to whether or not you're going to continue working during your cancer treatment. And I think also important that we remember, if we've decided to step away from our job, then we need to really step away from our job. We can't be saying to our employer, okay, yes, I'm on disability, but feel free to call me anytime, or feel free to send me a few Excel spreadsheets for me to take care of, or feel free to send me a few reports to write. No, you really shouldn't be doing that. Number one, it can jeopardize any short-term disability payments that you might be receiving from your insurance company. And number two, it's actually sending the wrong message to your employer, because it's giving them the impression that you're actually able to work while you're sick. And that's not the impression that we want to be giving. The other thing that I recommend when you're considering whether or not you should continue working while you are dealing with your cancer diagnosis is think ahead. In the first 1 or 2 months after you've started treatment, you might be feeling great. But if you're going to be having treatment for 6 months, and if you're going to be having, other things added on to that, radiation or surgery or whatnot, think about how you're going to be farther down the line in your journey, and really decide whether or not you feel as though you continue at work after you've gone through all of those other aspects of your care. So both employers and employees have rights and responsibilities, and the rights and responsibilities that pertain to your employer are basically, number one, they need to be responsive. I don't know how many times I've heard from cancer patients that they're calling the HR department and HR isn't calling them back, or they're not getting their forms back in a timely manner. And I'm hearing even more and more of that right now during COVID. Your employer has a responsibility to get back to you as quickly as possible. And if you see that you're not getting responses that you need in a timely manner, I would recommend that in writing, you send to your employer an email saying, listen, I need to get those documents back in time, because every step of the way, trying to get documents from your employer and then getting them signed by your oncologist and then sending them to the insurance company, that all takes time. And if your employer doesn't deliver on providing you with information or documentation that you need in a timely manner, you're the one who ends up suffering at the end of the line, because you're the one who ends up going without a short-term disability check from your insurance company because you've waited for your employer. So really, make sure that they understand how responsive they need, how responsive they need to be. Your employer also has the obligation of providing you details and assistance. And that can be on, a number of things. Probably the most important thing, with which your employer needs to provide you details is how are they planning on transitioning you back to work? So, do they see you sort of all of a sudden plunging right back into your job? And if that's the case, it's important that they confirm that to you in writing. Or are they flexible enough that they can come up with some sort of, progressive return to work in which you will be returning to part of your duties over time? There again, it's really important that you get that in writing. Make sure that everything that is said to you that you feel might end up being important, should you ever have to maybe look at pursuing this legally, make sure that you have all of these in writing. Also, your employer has a responsibility to communicate in a timely manner with your insurance company. So if you think that your employer maybe has not gotten forms back to your insurance company in time, you have the right to call your insurance company and follow up there and ask them to confirm to you in writing, no, we have not received the documents from your employer, and then send that to your employer and really put pressure on them. It is their obligation. And as I mentioned earlier, your employer has an obligation of confidentiality towards you when it comes to everything concerning your case. So you also have some rights and responsibilities when it comes to your employer. And the first thing that you really need to ensure you are doing is communicating, and really communicating in a timely manner, just the same way you expect your employer to be communicating. And, so if you have documents from the insurance company or documents from your oncologist that you think your employer should be made aware of because they affect your timeline about returning to work, or they affect the job that you are able to perform, it's really important that you communicate that information with your employer as soon as possible. You need to be cooperative, which means if your employer is calling you, make sure that you're calling them back within a reasonable time frame. And all of that being said, I guess the two things that I stress the most for people who are dealing with this is understand your company's concerns. And so when I say understand your company's concerns, really what I'm saying is, think as if you were your boss. What would my boss be worried about? My boss might be worried about whether or not I'm going to be there for the company's fiscal year end, whether or not I'm going to be there when they're, I don't know, when they're having the company picnic or whatnot. So it's important for you to make sure that you're always addressing those issues or keeping those issues in mind when you're responding to your employer. If you know that your employer has a peak part of the season where they really all hands on deck and you're pretty sure you're not going to be there during that period of time, it's important that you give them a heads up early on, so that they can maybe look at bringing in somebody temporarily to fill that void until you are able to come to work. And then finally, as I've mentioned a couple times so far, document everything. If you've had a phone call with your employer, document it. So that might be something like sending them an email saying, I'm just confirming with you what I understood from our conversation of this morning. I understood, and then list what you understood the key elements of your conversation were, and the points that both you and your employer understood. That's really important because you want to make sure that everything is clear for everybody. And you want to make sure that you have written proof of this if ever you need to, bring things up to the next level. So please document. So when you're returning to when you're planning your return to work, it's really important that you make sure that your oncologist, your nurse, your social worker, whoever is involved in your case, is also in agreement that it is time for you to go back to work. Because you don't want to go back to work before you're really ready for it. The worst thing that can happen is that you go back to work and you're actually not ready and you're not meeting expectations as to what your performance should be. And that's really a failed return to work. And you want to avoid that at all costs. So what I recommend to patients is that they do, they think about their job and they make a list of what their job entails. And even if you're working in an office job, your job actually has aspects of it that can be physically draining after you've gone through a cancer treatment. So if you have to be sitting at your desk for 8 hours typing, perhaps this is something that you're not able to do yet. Perhaps you're not able to sit for extended periods of time. Perhaps you're not able to, take public transport yet. All of these things need to be taken into consideration when you're looking at a return to work. So I recommend you make a list of all of the demands of your position. And it could even be demands related to concentration. Well documented that chemobrain is an actual physical or physiological state. So if you're unable to concentrate, then that's something you should be taking into consideration. Write all of these things down. And then sit there and do a self-evaluation. Say to yourself, am I able to sit for 8 hours at a time? Am I able to do this? Am I able to do that? And kind of check everything off and figure out whether or not you really are ready to begin a progressive return to work. Many hospitals actually have, I think it's occupational therapists or maybe the social workers who are able to sit down with you and help you go through this when you're thinking about attempting a return to work. But when you're at this stage, it's really important that you be honest with yourself and that you really reflect upon what your job entails and what it is that you are able to do. This is not the time to try to be, Superman or Superwoman. It's really a time to be honest and admit to yourself as well as to your medical team what it is that you are able to do. And I stress that it's important to share this with your medical team because they will document it in your file. And so if you're not, if you're suffering from chemobrain or if you have neuropathy or any of these things, you really need to make sure that your medical team is aware of this and they understand the point at which it affects you, so that when you're turning to them and saying, look, I don't think I'm ready to return back to work, it's not all of a sudden this surprise to them. So throughout your whole treatment and your involvement with the hospital, make sure that you're sharing with them all of these physical or physiological difficulties that you might be encountering, and that might affect your ability to return to work within a certain time frame. When you're doing that self-evaluation, or you're having somebody like your social worker or occupational therapist do that evaluation, try to come up with areas for adjustment. So it might be something like you've realized that you can sit and work for 2 hours at a time, but then you need to get up and you need to take a 15-minute break, walk around. Those are important things to understand. And these are the points that will actually help your employer should you be asking for some sort of reasonable accommodation. If you have solutions as to what your employer can put into place to help you with your return to work, then that's better for everybody involved. Excuse me. Also, as I mentioned, make sure that you're setting realistic expectations for yourself. Don't try to bite off more than you can chew as you're returning to work. And that's where having the conversation with your oncologist and the rest of your medical team from the get-go can really make a huge difference, because they will be able to help you throughout your treatment understand what is a realistic expectation for you in your return to work. As I mentioned, there are professional services and assistants. So it could be occupational therapist, it could be your social worker. Some companies actually do have third-party companies that can come in and take a look at your workspace and see what they can do to make your return to work easier. Excuse me. So, those are things that you might want to speak with your HR department with when you're thinking about a return to work. What is your right to reasonable accommodation, and what does this mean? And I actually had a question specifically on that, so I'm going to go into a little bit more detail. Reasonable accommodation is something that is recognized as a human right. So it is a protected right through our Quebec Charter. It is not something that typically the CNESST would protect an employee for, and it is typically not something that you would see recognized in any of our labor laws. There is mention of reasonable accommodation within the Loi sur les normes de travail, but it's really the droit de la personne, the Commission des droits de la personne, that is responsible for ensuring that person is receiving reasonable accommodation. So what is reasonable accommodation? Reasonable accommodation is the obligation of the employer to ensure that they are providing you with the tools or the adjustments necessary so that you can return back to performing your job. However, if this reasonable accommodation is something that the employer can say is just something that they're not able to meet, be it because they're a small company, they're not able to be as flexible as maybe your reasonable accommodation requires, then in those instances, an employer is not obliged to reasonably accommodate. And reasonable accommodation, I think it's fair to say, actually be easier to obtain in larger companies that have more positions available that they could offer to you, companies that are able to invest money into having, say, your workplace redesigned, whereas reasonable accommodation is often harder for smaller companies where there's a very limited amount of employees working there, not a lot of money that the company can invest in changing your workspace. So keep that in mind when you're looking at what reasonable accommodation is in your case. Reasonable accommodation, if you're looking at something, about the number of hours that you can work, or things that should be relatively easy for an employer to do, then I think that most employers would be required to meet that type of reasonable accommodation. Then finally, I guess what really this whole conversation, well, this whole seminar has been about, is it comes down to business versus compassion. And so I think it's always important that you remember these people, you work with them, you've built friendships with them, you've gone to company barbecues with them. They have compassion, they understand, but at the same time, they're running a business. And so it's really important that you're able to compartmentalize and make sure that, speaking to them as friends is one thing, but speaking to them about your cancer diagnosis and your employment is really something else. And make sure to kind of keep the two boxes separate from each other. It's really important that we do that, because I think ultimately, probably one of the hardest things that we can go through is a situation where we're having difficulty with an employer because of our cancer diagnosis, but at the same time, it's affecting our friendships with the people that we have in the organization. And that's something that we really want to avoid. Here are a few organizations that I recommend should you be looking for other information on what your rights are when you're looking at cancer and employment. Au bas de l'échelle is a confidential support group, and you can reach out to them confidentially and they can assist you. They're used to assisting people who've been living with a diagnosis and are looking at a return to work. And cancerandwork.ca is a great resource. I highly recommend it. You can also reach out to them. They are very responsive, but they have a lot of pertinent information on that website. And then the other two links are links to documents on how to manage a return to work that I think St. Mary's Hospital put together. So I know that there were some questions that were sent to Carly and Liz. I'm just going to take a look at those questions. I think I've addressed most of them. There was one question here. Somebody asked about, I would like to know what are the rights of a person who wants to change his job? Are we, in terms of insurance, entitled to the same coverage as a normal person, or does having a pre-existing condition limit us? So the answer to that is yes and no. What I recommend to people is, if you are looking at new employment, there is no legal reason for you to mention that you had a cancer diagnosis during the recruitment process, unless it is a physical job for which you know you cannot fulfill the job because of your physical limitations that you might have. So you cannot be applying for a job with the expectation that the employer immediately provide you with some sort of reasonable accommodation that they don't already offer. So what I mean is, if they have already accommodations for wheelchair access, Well, if you require a wheelchair, you're expecting them to create a new reasonable accommodation. So that's fine. But if you're applying for a job knowing full well that as the job is currently, you cannot fill the job unless you have reasonable accommodation, I would recommend applying for that job. If you do apply for that job and you have the intention of asking for reasonable accommodation, then yes, that's when you really need to be sharing that information during the recruitment process. However, if your cancer diagnosis does not affect your ability to perform the tasks of the job, you should not be sharing your cancer diagnosis with your employer with your possible employer during the recruitment process. It's only once you get the insurance forms for the medical insurance that your employer might offer that at that point in time you would need to reveal your cancer diagnosis to the insurance company should they ask the question on the form. And usually they'll ask, have you had a cancer diagnosis in the past 2 years, 5 years, or 10 years? And really all that information is doing is it's unfortunately probably in the short term going to affect your access to the disability aspect of the group benefits plan that your employer has, but does not affect your access to the medical insurance, the drug plan, or to the dental plan. And by that time, you're already hired. So I think, my question here is, my answer here is, can we change jobs? The answer is yes. Will it affect access to insurance? The answer there is yes, it will ensure access to the short-term disability, the long-term disability, and possibly the life insurance for at least a few years. Okay. I've been fighting with my disability insurance and they are bullies. Yes, they are bullies. I know that. What is one to do when we're about to give up, and after which point must one reach out to a lawyer to get help? For that particular question, it really depends on the specifics of the case. I think the person who asked that question, if they would like to reach out to Carly afterwards, and maybe we could look at a more personalized answer. But yes, I'm fully aware of the fact that insurance companies are bullies, which is why it's so important that you document everything. How does this affect self-employed individuals? Are there any tax benefits or credits if we do not fulfill the taxability sheets? The federal tax disability is very difficult to get. The term disability does not have the same definition across provincial, federal insurance companies. They all have different levels of what disability is. To get the federal tax disability is very difficult. Even for people with stage 4 cancer, it's almost impossible to get. And unfortunately, I do not know of any tax benefits or tax credits that people living with cancer are able to get above and beyond that tax, disability tax. If you feel ready to go back to work after treatment, but you're still experiencing fatigue and need special accommodations, how accommodating can one expect their employer to be? Well, as I mentioned, that's really depending on the type of employer you have and their ability to accommodate. But I think if you're looking at working from home, and if you're looking at issues around fatigue, particularly during this COVID time, it is incredible how we have found ways to work from home when previous to COVID, employers were saying, no, your job cannot be done from home. So if you are able to prove that, yes, you can do your job from home, then it would be very difficult for your employer to say that they are not able to meet this reasonable accommodation. So I would say go and ask for it. It is reasonable to ask for if it is a job that can be performed from home. And can the employer flat out refuse any special accommodation? They cannot flat out refuse. They need to know what the special accommodation is that you're asking for, and they need to be able to prove to you that they cannot meet your special accommodation. So they need to be able to explain why they are unable to do it. And if you feel that the reason that they are giving you does not make sense, then you need to reach out to the Quebec Human Rights Commission. If your employer is putting pressure to get back to work and resume your normal schedule, but you do not feel strong enough, who should you turn to? Well, yes, you can reach out to the CNE SST, but I would also recommend that you reach out to the Quebec Human Rights Commission. Oftentimes the two organizations kind of work hand in hand, but it's really important when you're saying that you do not feel strong enough that you have your medical team confirming that you are not strong enough. If your medical team says that you're able to go back to work, then it is highly unlikely that the Human Rights Commission would support your claim. So that's why it's really important that throughout the process, you constantly repeat to your medical team how you're feeling, and that you're honest about how you're feeling, so that when you say that you don't feel strong enough to go back to work, it's not a surprise to them. So make sure that your medical team is on board with the fact that you are suffering from fatigue, and it is not time for you to go back to work before you approach the government. So I think I've covered everything. Let me just
I have a few questions, Mei Lin, that were submitted to me either by email or in the chat. So if it's okay, I'm going to go through those.
Sure.
Great. So one is if somebody has two jobs, one is 3 days a week and one is 2 days a week, is it possible to start working less than those 3 days at the 3-day job? I guess it's a question about part-time employment.
So typically, if a person has 3 days with the same employer, they probably have their benefits with that employer. So if there are benefits with that employer, then what insurance company usually does, they're going to say, if your oncologist says, you can return to work 60% of the time. So the insurance company is going to understand, okay, 60% of 3 days. And then that's probably the way that you could go about doing this. However, if you were to be working full-time at the other job, and the job with whom you have your benefits finds out about it, that could cause you difficulty, because then you can turn around and say, you're actually capable of working more than 60% 3 days. You're capable of working 60% of 5 days, which is 3 days. So it's really, if you have any sort of insurance benefit attached to that 3-day-a-week job, I would be really careful at how I manage this.
Okay, so it sounds like there's a risk there.
Yeah, there's a risk.
Okay.
If you have benefits attached to it.
Okay. I have a little bit of a longer question just because of context. Someone started their progressive return to work and they're at 21 hours a week, but it was difficult to get there. It was a process followed by an oncologist and big help from the occupational therapist as well. Insurance has stepped in and wants to bump this person up to full time. They had initially agreed, but there were lots of conditions that were quite stressful. It sounds like they're looking to get this person to full time within 12 weeks. The question is, can insurance force you to get back to work full time? They even put remarks that I couldn't take a day off for an appointment and would have to make up my hours later during the 12 weeks.
With, can you tell by the question if it was the employer that was putting in that condition, or was it the insurance?
The insurance.
Can't tell by the question.
Oh,
It's
I'm hearing the
insurance.
person. Thank you.
Insurance.
It's the insurance. It's
Okay. Okay. So insurance companies have protocols, and according to the protocols, if you've had this type of cancer, this stage, and this type of surgery, whatever, you should be, 99% of patients go back to work within this period of time. And that's what they apply to every situation, is their typical protocol. If your oncology team is able to clearly demonstrate that your case is not within the protocol, that there is something about your case that is very different, then they need to get the insurance company to understand why your case is different, at which they will step back and review the case. But if there is nothing about your case that makes it extremely different from the typical case, then the insurance company will begin asking for more medical evidence and ask for you to meet with, possibly with their medical team, asking that your medical file be sent to their medical team for review, and really ramping up the pressure. So unless you really have something to prove that your case is different than the norm, there's not much you can do to avoid going through all of this with the insurance company. It is typical protocol.
Okay, thank you for that.
I don't think I gave the answer the person wanted to hear,
Yeah,
but
it sounds like it's not the ideal answer, but maybe that person can follow up with me and we can see if there's a more individual discussion that needs to be had. I have a
Yes.
question.
Thank you.
Yes.
I have a question here about employers.
Actually, if I could just go
ahead.
I was just going to say, yes, sorry. Sometimes we need to make the distinction between, is the not being able to return to work due solely to the cancer, or has something else come into play, and that's also affecting our ability to return to work. And I think it's very fair to say that in many, many instances, dealing with a cancer diagnosis is a traumatic experience, and we end up suffering from possibly psychological aspects to the cancer that your oncologist might not be putting on paper, but he can refer you to a psychologist, for example, who can begin documenting that part of it. And maybe in many instances, that's what needs to be taking place, is that we're transitioning from, okay, it's not just the cancer diagnosis itself, it evolved into a PTSD or whatever, and this is the issue that's really causing the fatigue and the inability to return to work or whatever. So, sorry.
That's cool.
Okay.
I have a bunch of other questions, so we'll try and get through as many as we can. Okay. Do you have any advice on the do's and don'ts, or mostly the don'ts, when you are filling out documents for long-term disability for insurance, that when they're looking for that one thing that you might say that can cost you your rights to your benefits, like any do's and don'ts, any tips?
Yeah. When they I'm the master at this, been doing it for 12 years. They ask you these vague questions like, what does your typical day look like? And you really limit that. Make sure that you're saying, you're not saying go out and play golf, for example, or I'm taking care of my grandchildren, or anything like that. Really need to make sure that whatever you write indicates that you do not have the ability to be working. I wrote at one point that I was volunteering. Boy, did they call me. What do you mean you're volunteering? What are you doing? And I'm like, I'm volunteering. So really make sure that you don't open the door to any indication that you might be feeling well enough to do something.
Okay. Question about vaccines. Employers are not allowed to force all employees in the workforce to be vaccinated. I may at one point be ready to return for a progressive return. How am I to deal with non-vaccinated coworkers? Adding to the stress of my fear of cancer and now this new fear of the employee that I'm not sure if you can answer this, but it's an interesting question for sure to think about. Thoughts?
So actually, it's really interesting because right now there's a part of our public health law that nobody's talking about, and I don't know why. But anyways, our the Premier Ministre, the Premier, actually has the right to force all Quebecers to get vaccinated should there be a pandemic. And he hasn't talked about that yet. But I have a suspicion that if we see that we're not getting to the 70%, that at one point or another, this occurs. That being said, employers are obliged to ensure that their employees are working within a safe environment. So it's just a matter of time before employers start saying to their employees, we cannot ensure that we have a safe environment if you are refusing to get vaccinated. So I think, you know, the question is really a legitimate concern, but I have a feeling that the question will end up getting sorted out because there will be more than just, you know, us cancer patients asking this question. And I believe most employers will end up telling their employees, you have to get vaccinated or we can't guarantee the safe workplace.
Yeah, it sounds like it's continuing to evolve.
That's just my,
yeah.
Yes.
Okay. How does a patient dealing with the situation of insurance and return to work deal with
that? That is mine. I think she just answered it.
Okay.
Okay.
Not sure. In terms of insurance, when you're changing your job, does the new employer's insurance apply as a regular employee, or will the fact that you have...
Okay, I kind of answered that.
Yeah, I think you answered that.
Yeah, I answered that one. Yeah.
A couple of questions about self-employed dealing with insurance and return to work. It seems like insurance companies have no compassion and their objective is to avoid payment. Any recommendations as someone who's self-employed dealing with insurance?
You know, I have to admit, all of my encounters with have just been awful. I don't, all I can say is possibly get yourself a lawyer, because it is true. They just don't pay for self-employed, you know, according to my experience. Unfortunately, I don't have any words of wisdom.
Okay. Une question en français. Si c'est plus facile,
Oui.
on peut constituer par courriel, mais si vous pouvez répondre en français, ça serait mieux pour cette participante. Le bureau de santé de la CSDM, alors je pense que c'est la commission scolaire de Montréal, dit que pour avoir le droit à l'exemption, il faut que la maladie soit finie, mais il n'explique pas exactement c'est quoi que la maladie soit finie. J'aimerais savoir que qu'est-ce que mon médecin doit écrire dans sa lettre à mon employeur pour avoir droit à cet accès, à cette exemption?
Je comprends pas, c'est quoi l'exemption? Ça veut dire l'acquittement raisonnable?
Je ne sais pas, c'est...
Peut-être ce serait mieux qu'on fasse ça en privé, parce que je comprends pas qu'est-ce que c'est l'exemption en question.
OK, parfait. Alors, on va continuer par écrit pour cette question-là.
Okay, parfait.
OK. Hold on. OK, we answered that already. Je suis infirmière. Si mon employeur me demande de faire travailler double chiffre, est-ce que je peux refuser ou est-ce qu'il faut que mon oncologue le précise à mon retour?
Il faut que ça soit précisé par l'oncologue lors de votre retour. Si c'est pas précisé, l'hôpital en question va résumer que vous avez la capacité de travailler comme avant. Et je crois qu'à ce moment-là, ça va être considéré comme un refus injustifié ou quelque chose comme ça. Donc, il faut vraiment que ce soit écrit par l'oncologue que vous n'êtes pas capable de faire un double shift ou vous n'êtes pas capable de travailler plus de temps dans une période de temps d'heure.
Okay. In terms of progressive return, if I decide to return for 20 hours at first, will I only be paid for 20 hours? Just curious because in terms of income, it will go down compared to what I'm getting from my insurance.
Okay. So if the person is working full-time, typically, if the person was working full-time, typically what happens is the insurance company during the progressive return to work looks at how much money you're earning from your employer. The employer reports that to the insurance company, and the insurance company subtracts that amount from what your typical amount is then. So if normally you're receiving $500 a week from the insurance company and you're working 20 hours a week, so you're receiving $200 a week, the insurance company will pay you the remaining $300 a week. That will continue throughout the progressive return to work until eventually the insurance company paying you zero because you're now back to work full time.
I think you may have answered this next one, but just to clarify, someone didn't have a job before they were diagnosed, but after chemotherapy, I'd like to find one later. Do I have to mention that I had cancer? So I think you answered that.
No! No!
Une autre question en français. Lorsqu'on parle de retour progressif, lorsqu'on travaille à temps plein, on parle de combien de jours par semaine?
Mm-hmm.
Est-ce que ça dépend?
Oui, ça dépend, mais typiquement, on commence avec 2 demi-jours par semaine. Après ça, 3 demi-jours par semaine. Après ça, 3 journées pleines par semaine, 4 journées. Voilà. Et normalement, le laps de temps de début jusqu'à la fin est comme 12 semaines. Donc, c'est comme 2 semaines à chaque niveau. Et comme j'ai mentionné tantôt, les compagnies d'assurance ont des protocoles. Donc, c'est vraiment comme ça, comme ça, comme ça, à moins que l'oncologue spécifie d'une façon différente. Et si votre oncologue est prête et ouvert à spécifier d'une autre façon, souvent, je le recommande.
After cancer treatment, can genetic testing affect employment and insurance? Can the discovery of a genetic issue affect insurance prospects or deny my family members and children coverage?
Okay, so that's a little bit outside of the employment and work issue, but it's actually something that we are seeing happen in Canadian insurance law. Unfortunately, we are seeing discrimination of people who have genetic predispositions to certain cancers that insurance companies are using in order to not cover. So yes, unfortunately, we are seeing that. That being said, though, there are many organizations that are looking to contest that genetic discrimination. And so hopefully it will get quashed in courts within the next couple of years. And, you know, it's important to know 1 out of 2 Canadians is going to get a cancer diagnosis in their lifetime. So, you know, the insurance companies have to deal with those odds. Also, the more innovative we become as a society, the more we're going to be able to identify genetic means to figure out who's going to possibly get a cancer diagnosis. So genetic testing will identify more people, which is why this type of discrimination needs to really be eliminated as quickly as possible. But yes, it is currently happening. Hopefully not for that much longer.
Okay, last question that I could see. And I just asked for clarification on this. Does the employer have the right to fire you after a few months of starting your job? I don't know if that person means, if you can clarify, do you mean starting your job like returning to work, or you mean, okay, so returning to work. So do they have the right to fire you after a few weeks or a few months after returning to work?
Okay, so that's one of the reasons why I talk about how it's so important to make sure that everything's been understood, everybody, timelines have been understood, your abilities when you return to work have been properly understood. And that's why I talk about making sure that you understand what it is you're able to do. Because if you if you think that you're 100% capable and you show up at work and if you're getting 100% of your paycheck, it gets to a point where your employer can say, I'm sorry, we're paying you like you're fully capable, and yet you're not fully capable. And so typically I would say, if you've been back full-time for a good 6 months and you're not 100% up and running, you might feel that it is time to have a conversation with your employer and share with them that you're not 100% up and running, and that you need sort of to come up with some sort of solution with them before they start looking at terminating you, because at that point in time, they've shown that they've been of good faith, and you could look at being terminated.
Oh, I see one more coming in.
We have the right to turn.
Yeah.
Okay, so many insurance companies have a time frame in which you can return back onto long-term. You need to look at your specific insurance contract. Usually it's 3 months or 6 months. So that's why I'm saying to you, after 6 months, your employer has the right to terminate you. If you say it's 3 months, if within 3 months you realize, oh no, I should not come back, then you can go back onto your long-term disability. Usually they require a letter from your oncologist, but you don't have, it's not like you're restarting a new file. It's like you're going back onto your old long-term disability. So before you go back to work, make sure that you know from your insurance contract what that time frame is, and make sure that if you need to go back onto long-term disability, you've done it before that term ends.
I think that's it, Mei Lin. Je pense que c'est tout fini. Alors, thank you so much. This is such an important topic that I don't think gets addressed as quickly as we wish it would by employers, and maybe people don't know about it or don't think about it. So thank you so much for highlighting something so important. And this recording will be available. If you have any questions for Mei Lin, please feel free to email me directly and I will get in touch with Mei Lin. But thank you again, everyone, and thanks for coming. Merci d'être venu. Si vous avez des questions pour Mei Lin, vous pouvez m'envoyer un courriel directement à moi et je vais communiquer avec elle vos questions. Merci tout le monde.
Merci. Bye.